Under the quiet veil of night, when the campfires of Half-Blood Hill have burned down to soft embers, and the waves against the Long Island shore whisper like old friends, there is a story worth telling, not of the loudest hero or the flashiest quest, but of the girl who could outthink monsters, outplan gods, and walk through the world with a Yankee baseball cap that could turn her invisible and yet somehow make her the most noticeable presence in any room. Annabeth Chase's story begins not in the safety of camp, but in the restless corridors of a mortal home that never quite felt like hers, where the daughter of a mortal professor and the goddess of wisdom struggled to belong in a family split between two worlds, the divine and the ordinary, and where even love could feel like a negotiation. Her father, Frederick Chase, cared for her, but his new wife and children were human through and through. And when the divine blood in Annabeth began to show in her quick tongue and restless need for adventure, home became less of a refuge and more of a cage. So at 7 years old, small enough to be overlooked but stubborn enough to survive, she ran not in some grand declaration of rebellion, but in the quiet way of a child who knows she's no longer safe where she is, carrying only a hammer for protection and a mind that already mapped the shadows of the world ahead. It was in those uncertain, dangerous nights that she met two older demigods, Thalia Grace, fierce and unyielding, with a heart that masked its bruises behind sarcasm, and Luke Castellan, who, to a lonely little girl, seemed every bit the hero she had dreamed of. Together, they traveled roads and back alleys, surviving on scraps, defending each other from monsters that ordinary people couldn't see, and all the while Annabeth learned not just how to fight, but how to think, how to read the tilt of a doorway, to guess what might be behind it, how to tell if a stranger's smile was a threat in disguise, how to hide in plain sight when there was no place to run. They called themselves family, because in that harsh, in-between world, family wasn't just blood, it was whoever would bleed for you. And Annabeth clung to that idea like a shield, because for the first time, she had a place where she wasn't the odd one out. The journey to Camp Half-Blood was not a straight path. It was punctuated by hunts in the dark, whispered warnings from Luke, and Thalia's constant protective presence, until the day a monster cornered them near the borders of camp, and Thalia made the choice that would etch itself into Annabeth's heart, forever standing her ground so the others could escape. A choice that ended with her transformed into a pine tree by Zeus to save her life, rooted forever at the camp's edge as a living barrier. For Annabeth, stepping into Camp Half-Blood without Thalia was stepping into safety and loss at the same time, the gates representing both sanctuary and the knowledge that not even heroes are untouchable. There, among the cabins painted in the colors of the gods, Annabeth found her place in Cabin 6 Athena's Children, a place where quick thinking was valued as much as skill with a blade, where strategy was a language and puzzles were the games of choice. And yet even in that world of half-gods, she was still the youngest for a time, the smallest, the one who had to prove she belonged. Luke became her closest friend, almost an older brother, training her, teasing her, making her feel seen, and she looked at him the way mortals might look at the sun, with awe and trust, not realizing until much later that even the brightest lights can cast deep shadows. She learned to fight with daggers, to climb the rock wall slick with lava, to map the camp's terrain in her mind until she could navigate it blindfolded, and with every year she built a reputation not as the loudest or strongest, but as the one you wanted at your side when the stakes were highest. Still, the world beyond camp called to her, not with reckless curiosity, but with the certainty that her life's purpose wasn't going to be contained within safe borders. Prophecies murmured through the camp, tales of a child of the Big Three who would change the fate of Olympus, but those were other people's destinies, at least until the day a boy named Percy Jackson arrived, half drowned and confused, carrying the sea in his eyes and trouble at his heels. A boy who, without knowing it, would rewrite the course of her life. But before we reach that moment, before the quests and betrayals, the laughter and heartbreak, the battles in shadowed streets, and the fall into the darkest pit of the world, we must linger here, at the edge of Annabeth's beginning, where the lessons of survival, loyalty, and quiet cunning were forged. For it is in these first steps, under the watchful branches of Thalia's pine, and the shifting constellations above the campfire light, that the girl with the Yankee cap became not just another demigod, but the architect of her own fate. And it is from here, as the night wind carries the salt smell of the sea, that we follow her into the first chapter of the legend, the day she crossed paths with Percy Jackson, in the story of the Lightning Thief. Beneath the soft hum of cicadas and the gentle crash of waves against the shore outside Camp Half-Blood, the story of Annabeth Chase's role in the Lightning Thief begins not with a sword in her hand, but with her observing the newest arrival to camp from a quiet corner, her sharp grey eyes following every move of the boy who had been dragged in unconscious by a satyr and a mortal woman who clearly knew far more than she was saying. Percy Jackson, son of Poseidon, though none of them knew it yet, had arrived under storm clouds that even Annabeth found unsettling, and as he lay in the infirmary muttering in his sleep, she sat by, curiosity warring with the instinct to keep her distance, because experience had taught her that new arrivals often meant trouble, and trouble in the demigod world meant someone was about to die. Still, when he woke, groggy and confused, and asked if she was Annabeth, she felt a spark of something unusual, the fate's threads tugging, and though her words were clipped, she already suspected this boy might change everything. In the days that followed, she kept her watch from the training grounds, seeing how Percy's awkward, instinctive moves with a sword somehow kept him standing longer than expected against more seasoned campers. And she listened to the whispers from the Oracle's cave about unrest among the gods, a missing master bolt, and a brewing storm between Zeus and Poseidon. So when Chiron revealed that Percy was being accused of the theft and was to be sent on a quest, Annabeth's pulse quickened not with fear, but with the thrill of the game, the call of the hero's path. She had been waiting years to join, for she had trained for this, studied every Greek text, and dreamed of proving herself beyond the boundaries of camp. When she was chosen to join Percy and Grover on the journey west, her mind was already mapping routes and contingency plans, the weight of her dagger at her side as familiar as the breath in her lungs. Their departure from camp was quiet compared to the scale of the task ahead, but the moment they stepped onto the road, Annabeth's instincts came alive. She kept Percy walking on the safer side of the highway, eyes scanning overpasses for the glint of bronze talons, ears tuned for the sound of leathery wings. When the Furies attacked in the bus, her movements were clean, precise, and practiced no wasted strikes, no hesitation, and though Percy fought with raw, unpredictable power, Annabeth's role was to see the angles, create openings, and get them out alive, which she did in a calculated blur of combat and quick thinking that left Percy staring at her like she was something more than just a girl from camp. As they traveled from roadside diners to the deceptive comfort of Auntie M's garden gnome emporium, Annabeth began to measure Percy not just as a fighter, but as a person. filing away his impulsive bravery, his stubborn loyalty, and the way he looked at the world, like every challenge was a wave to be ridden rather than a wall to be stopped by. And though she didn't say it aloud, she started to like him for that. In the Gorgon's lair, her warnings about looking into Medusa's eyes were sharp, but not unkind. And when Percy took the kill, Annabeth recognized it as both reckless and necessary, the mark of someone who would never let fear dictate his choices. On trains, in borrowed trucks, and beneath star-choked skies, she began sharing pieces of herself in quiet moments, her dream of becoming an architect, her loyalty to her mother's wisdom, and the camp's survival, not because Percy asked, but because trust, once earned, was a rare and precious thing to her. The Gateway Arch in St. Louis tested them further, with the sudden vicious attack from Echidna and the Chimera, forcing Percy into a plunge that no mortal or demigod should have survived. And when he resurfaced days later alive, dripping and still stubbornly determined to finish the quest, Annabeth's respect for him deepened into something she wasn't ready to name. As they neared the underworld's edge, facing the Lotus Casino's dreamlike trap and the eerie stillness of the dead's domain, Annabeth's resolve only sharpened. Every challenge was an any step closer to proving herself, to making her years of training mean something. And though she argued with Percy over tactics, her mind was always 3 moves ahead, playing the board like the child of Athena she was. Still under the golden light of California sunsets and the shadows of the underworld's gates, she couldn't ignore that somewhere along this dangerous road, Percy Jackson had shifted from the new guy to my quest partner, and that distinction, quiet, personal, and unspoken, was going to matter far more than either of them knew. The road into the underworld was never meant for the living, and Annabeth knew it. Every step past the ashen gates felt like walking deeper into a trap she couldn't see, her fingers tight on the hilt of her dagger as they followed Charon's boat across the black waters of the Styx. She kept her voice low, explaining quietly to Percy and Grover the dangers of speaking too much, of drawing attention to themselves in a place where every shadow had teeth, because this wasn't a battleground you could win by strength alone here. The enemy was patience, temptation, and despair. When they reached Hades' throne room, the weight of the air pressed against her chest, heavier than any monster's glare, and Annabeth stood shoulder to shoulder with Percy, ready to fight if words failed. But it was words that mattered here, not blades, and she watched as Percy, raw and unpolished, still managed to stand up to the Lord of the Dead, refusing to be crushed by the accusation of theft that still hung over them. Her mind ran calculations, exits, distances, the angle of Hades' spear, but the real escape came from a truth Percy unearthed. The Master Bolt wasn't here at all. Leaving the underworld felt like a half-victory, like sprinting out of a maze only to find another wall waiting. The return to the surface was worse than the descent, because the clock was running out, and the Olympians were at the brink of war. When they finally confronted Ares on the beach, Annabeth stood at the edge of the fight, dagger ready, her instincts screaming to intervene, but knowing this was Percy's battle to finish. She caught every feint, every reckless charge, and when he emerged victorious, bleeding but alive, she felt a flicker of pride she didn't allow to reach her face. The return to Olympus was nothing like she imagined. No applause, no warmth, only the cold grandeur of thrones the size of skyscrapers and gods who barely looked at them as people. Yet, as Percy stood before Zeus and Poseidon, holding his ground, Annabeth realized she was seeing something rare, a mortal-born hero who didn't shrink under divine judgment. Their quest ended at Camp Half-Blood with the summer sun heavy on their backs, the prophecy fulfilled, and the war averted for now. Luke's betrayal at the end cut deeper than any monster's claws. When she saw him for what he truly was, the boy she once admired for his skill and leadership became the first ghost in a line that would haunt her for years. Still, she didn't crumble. She stood beside Percy as the summer shifted to autumn, their paths splitting, but with the unspoken knowledge that this was only the beginning. She had measured him, tested him, and found him worthy enough to stand beside her, though she would never admit it outright. And as she watched him walk away, the wind off the Long Island Sound curling her hair, Annabeth Chase knew that their story, tangled in quests, prophecies, and something like friendship, was far from over. The summer should have been quiet, a return to Camp Half-Blood, a break from monsters and gods. But Annabeth Chase had learned long ago that peace was only the pause between storms, and when she found Percy at school, cornered by Laestrygonian giants in the middle of a dodgeball game gone wrong, she didn't waste time with hellos. She fought with the kind of precision that came from years of training, spinning her Yankees cap onto her head for invisibility, striking where the enemy never expected. She had been tracking strange signs, disturbances in the camp's borders, whispers that Thalia's tree was sick, and now the truth spilled out as they fled the wreckage. The magical protections around Camp Half-Blood were failing, poisoned by an unknown hand. Percy didn't understand yet what that meant, but Annabeth did. Without those wards, the camp would fall, and every demigod inside it would be slaughtered. The answer lay in the Golden Fleece, an artifact of healing and protection lost in the sea of monsters, a place sailors called the Bermuda Triangle, where maps were useless and the horizon itself could betray you. When Chiron was wrongly accused and banished, Tantalus took his place as activities director, a cruel reminder that not all enemies wore monster faces, and Annabeth's frustration burned quietly behind her grey eyes. She'd seen leaders like him before, smug, dismissive, more interested in rules than lives. The quest to retrieve the fleece was meant for Clarice, daughter of Ares, but Annabeth had no intention of sitting this one out. When Percy and his newly revealed half-brother Tyson, a Cyclops, set sail, she joined them without hesitation, even if the sight of Tyson stirred her deepest mistrust. Cyclops had taken something from her in the past, and though she kept her tone clipped, her mind was always working, watching him for weakness, for danger. Their journey through the sea of monsters was nothing like the quests she'd read about in books. It was stranger, quieter, more suffocating, an ocean where the water could turn on you, where a friendly island could keep you forever, where the voices you trusted might belong to sirens luring you toward your own destruction. When Annabeth deliberately let herself hear the siren's song, she swam toward them knowing it could kill her, desperate to see the life she wished she could have, a world where her family was whole, where she had built something lasting, where she was the architect of safety itself. Percy saved her, dragging her back to the boat, but she hated the weakness it revealed, that part of her still longed for a home that could never exist. The weight of the prophecy, still half hidden from Percy, gnawed at her. She had seen enough to know that their fates were not separate, that every choice they made meant the future in ways neither of them could predict. As they closed in on Polyphemus's island, the pieces aligned in her mind, the fleece guarded by a monster too cunning to be underestimated, Clarice somewhere on the island, and a trap waiting for all of them. Annabeth knew Cyclops, knew their pride and their blindness. and she planned their approach carefully, using herself as bait. Her voice and movements calculated to keep Polyphemus's attention off Percy and Tyson. But even the best plans fray when the stakes are this high, and she could already feel the tension in the air, the moment when all their lives would balance on the edge of one wrong step. The battle on Polyphemus's island was chaos wrapped in salt spray and shouts. Annabeth darting between jagged rocks, her mind racing 3 steps ahead, even as the Cyclops' massive hands reached for her. She knew how to use his arrogance, how to keep him turning toward her voice and away from the others. But every feint cost her strength, and when his club came down too close, the ground shook hard enough to knock the air from her lungs. Percy and Tyson moved in like 2 halves of a strike team that shouldn't have worked, one reckless, one earnest, and together they drew Polyphemus's rage just long enough for Clarice to grab the fleece. Annabeth had no time to savor the moment. Polyphemus's roar rolled over the beach like thunder, and the chase began in earnest, every footstep pounding through her head as they scrambled for the ship. The monster's bellow promised they wouldn't make it far, but Tyson's sudden dive into the surf bought them a heartbeat's lead, and in the sea of monsters, a heartbeat could be everything. They were battered, salt-stung, and still reeling when Charybdis and Scylla loomed on the horizon, their passage narrowing to a death trap. Annabeth's hands gripped the wheel, mind working angles and distances as if she could redraw the sea itself. But in the end, it was instinct and luck, and Percy's willingness to risk everything that pulled them through. She felt the fleece's power almost instantly, the air around it humming with life. But bringing it home was not a victory march. Luke Castellan was waiting, his ship a predator's shadow on the waves. His betrayal burned more every time she saw him, the boy she'd once trusted without question, now wearing Kronos' will like armor. And when the fighting broke out, she didn't hesitate to stand between him and Percy. Words meant nothing here, only steel did. The escape back to camp was a blur of spray and adrenaline. But the moment the fleece touched Thalia's tree, Annabeth saw the magic flare like sunrise, and then saw something she couldn't have predicted. A girl's figure, solidifying where there had been only bark, armor catching the morning light. Thalia Grace, daughter of Zeus, alive. For Annabeth, it was more than a miracle. It was a ripple in the prophecy she'd carried in the back of her mind for years. The number of children of the big 3 had just doubled, and that meant the future had changed in ways she couldn't yet map. She stood in the shadow of the tree, watching Thalia breathe again, and felt the weight of every quest, every choice, every friendship and betrayal, settling over her shoulders like a cloak. This was no ending. It was the shiver before the next storm, and Annabeth knew storms better than anyone. The first snow came to camp like quiet punctuation, a soft hush on the strawberry fields and the pine needles. And with it came that familiar pressure Annabeth Chase had learned to read as well as any blueprint, the sense that a load-bearing wall somewhere in the world had begun to crack. She sharpened her dagger, rolled up maps that had never really been put away, and when the call arrived, monsters at a boarding school in Maine, 2 unclaimed demigods under the watch of a teacher whose smile felt like a trap. She was already halfway into her jacket, the old Yankees cap warm in her palm. Westover Hall was all stone and shadow, a fortress that pretended to be a school, its corridors echoing with the kind of silence that collects around secrets. And as the winter wind bullied the eaves, Annabeth slipped through service doors and stairwells, watching the patterns of faculty keys and camera sweeps, while Percy and Thalia took the front door, with Grover playing the part of nervous new kid so convincingly it made Annabeth's heart tighten with a memory of smaller, hungrier days. The gym glittered with cheap decorations, paper stars, and a disco ball turning circles of cold light. Teenagers moving in awkward constellations, while the music tried to pretend this was a normal night. And across that floor she found them, the D'Angelo kids, Bianca with wary eyes that catalogued exits the way survivors do, Nico radiating the kind of curiosity that will always be dangerous in a world with teeth. Between them and safety stood Dr. Thorne, who smelled like he'd borrowed the idea of humanity without reading the instructions, and everything in Annabeth went very, very still. She knew the shape of a trap when she saw one, and still the only way out was through. So she crossed the floor in a dress she didn't remember choosing, smiled a smile that said nothing to see here, and steered the kids toward the doors while her other hand touched the edge of invisibility in her pocket like a talisman. It lasted exactly as long as it could, one song, two, and then the manticore stopped pretending to be a man. The gym doors slammed. The air turned knife cold. And the next minutes were the kind of blur you only survive by instinct. Thorne's spined tail lancing the air, Percy's sword answering with bronze that remembered older snows, Thalia calling lightning that painted rafters white, Grover herding the D'Angelos with a shepherd's panic. Annabeth moved like the map in her head was updating 100 times a second, throwing herself into the space that would let somebody else breathe, but the numbers were against them and the building itself felt complicit, until silver cut the dark and the hunters of Artemis arrived like a chapter turning, arrows stitching bright lines through shadow, while Zoe Nightshade's voice carried the calm of a commander who has already predicted your next mistake. The battle rolled onto the bluff beyond the gym, wind tearing at hair and coats, the Atlantic below a hungry black, and Artemis herself stepped into the snow as if it had been waiting for her, eyes like cold moons taking in Thorne's defiance. The terrified kids, the demigods braced between flight and stand. It should have ended then, goddess present, monster outmatched, but traps do not survive by fairness, and in the split-second violence always steals. Thorne's tail snapped, and arm hooked Annabeth by the waist, yanking her backward toward the cliff's mouth, while snow and sky switched places in her vision. She had time to see Percy's face change, something wild and raw igniting under the green. Time to see Thalia's hand reach too late. Time to make one decision that mattered. Twist her grip, shove the D'Angelo kids toward the hunters, and meet the drop like a problem that could be solved. The fall was a poem of cold and wind, then the jagged bite of rock, then darkness that wasn't empty so much as waiting. When she woke, she was not awake the way campfire nights are awake. She was awake the way prisoners are, aware of bindings that shifted when she tested them, of a smell in the air like old storms and older stone, of voices she knew she wasn't meant to hear, Luke's easy as ever and ruined by what sat behind it, and another voice like pressure, like a mountain making the air thin, the general whose presence turned the room into a low ceiling under which even thoughts had to crouch. If fear came, she folded it small and put it in a pocket. There would be time for it later, or there would not. And instead, she did what daughters of Athena do when the ground drops out. She catalogued everything, the cadence of steps, the intervals between guards, the way the corridor pooled damp near the left-hand turn, the faint metal tang that suggested chains held something far larger, and more terrible than a girl. Somewhere above her, the world kept moving. She could feel it through stone. The way you feel thunder before you hear it. Artemis's tread lighter than her gravity should allow. Zoe arguing with silence like a person who has practiced not being heard. Bianca's small breaths learning the rhythm of the hunt. Thalia's stormfront patience thinning by degrees. Annabeth thought of Luke when he had been only Luke, of the hand he had held out to a 7-year-old in the dark. And then she thought of the poisoned tree, the kids who would never get to choose the name of their fear, the way his eyes had looked the last time he'd said her name. Past tense, past tense. And she packed that, too, into the same pocket as fear. Time shivered, as it does when gods are making choices, and in its wake came a stillness that tasted like snow. Artemis, gone from the hunt not because she had tired of the chase, but because she had found the thing worth chasing and traded her place in the sky for a prison only gods can build for gods. Annabeth tested her bonds again, slowly, efficiently, wincing when a strand cut skin, and continued to build the blueprint she would need to live. If she couldn't break, she would loosen. If she couldn't loosen, she would wait. If she couldn't wait, she would signal. All the while, she kept the conversation between Luke and the general playing in the theater of her head, fitting logistics to motive, motive to myth, until a lattice of answers took shape. Mount Tam, the old stronghold near the Pacific, a burden no one can bear alone, a plan to pull the sky down onto the heads of children and call it justice. Above, the rescue party formed in the exact geometry her heart expected. Zoe, because honor is nothing if it can't bend. Thalia, because a storm is a promise as much as a threat. Grover, because loyalty is a road you walk even when your legs shake. And Percy, because water finds every weakness in stone until the stone finally yields. She let herself imagine the sound their footsteps would make on the last approach. How the air would crackle around Thalia's hair. How Zoe would notch an arrow half a breath too soon. How Percy would set his jaw in that stubborn way that said he was about to do something both necessary and impossible. And then she stopped imagining and counted the beats of the gods' patrol again and again, until counting became a rope she could hold. The sky changed. She felt it in the ache under her collarbones, and with it came a new pressure, heavier, desperate, not on the world, but in it. And Annabeth knew with the same certainty. She knew the load limits of a span bridge that Artemis had taken on something she was never meant to carry. That somewhere above this stone, the huntress was bowed and brilliant, and suffering by choice, buying time with divinity, while the rescue spent mortal minutes like coins. The door scraped. A tray of water kissed the floor near her feet. A guard whose breath smelled of iron and pines grunted, indifferent. Annabeth drank slowly and let the cold run down her throat like a promise. There is a way out, she told the part of her mind that wanted panic. There always is. You just haven't drawn it yet. And in the chill silence after the guard left, she closed her eyes and saw the cliff again. Not the fall, but the moment before, Percy's face lit by lightning, the curve of his mouth set to no. And she understood that sometimes the thing you build isn't a plan, or a tower, or a city. Sometimes it's the unbreakable line between people who have chosen each other. The architecture of trust holding a span across a drop that would swallow anyone walking alone. And with that truth warm as a coal in her sternum, she waited for the sound she knew was coming. The footfalls that meant her friends had found the door, the air's intake before a fight, the clean, cold note of fate when a blade is drawn for the right reason. The air on Mount Tam tasted wrong, too clean for the danger it carried, like a blade polished to hide the rust, and every step the rescue party took toward its summit felt like walking deeper into the blueprint of someone else's victory. Annabeth could feel it through the stone, the vibrations of boots and hooves threading closer, weaving with the low hum of something impossibly old just beyond her cell, and she measured those beats against the pace of her own pulse, syncing them until her body knew they were coming as surely as dawn follows night. The door's hinges had a whine she'd memorized days ago, but when it moved this time, it did so in silence, the lock sliding back under a hand that knew locks the way rivers know valleys. And there was Percy, sea salt hair damp with fog, eyes wide with the relief he wouldn't have admitted even to himself, and for a second the plan in her head collapsed into something simpler. Get to him, get out, breathe air that wasn't owned by the enemy. But rescue in their world never stayed simple. Behind him was Zoe, bow already drawn, Thalia crackling with restrained lightning, Grover's eyes darting for exits like a shepherd counting sheep. And beyond them all, the corridor stretched toward the chamber where Artemis's presence pulsed like a star held underwater. Annabeth moved without needing to be told, slotting herself into their formation, absorbing the way Zoe's shoulder brushed hers like a wordless promise, and how Percy's hand briefly touched her arm as if to check she was real. The climb to the peak was a gauntlet of things meant to stall them. Destinies whose spears scraped sparks from Thalia's shield. Skeletal warriors that refused to stay down unless blessed silver kissed their bones. Winds that shoved instead of howled, each hazard buying the enemy more time. By the time they reached the summit clearing, the sky had gone the color of deep bruise, the air too thin, and there she was, Artemis, kneeling under the weight of the sky itself, her arms locked against trembling, her eyes locked on a horizon only she could see. The general stood near her, the kind of stillness that's more dangerous than motion, and beside him Luke, whose smirk carried the same blueprint flaw Annabeth had tried not to see the last time they spoke. What followed was less a battle, and more a test of which truths would break first. Steel met claw, oath met betrayal, lightning met bronze, and all of it happened under the shadow of a burden too big for any god or girl to bear. Annabeth moved toward Artemis without thinking, every calculation screaming at her that removing the goddess from that weight meant taking it herself, and she was ready, because she understood foundations, understood that you could hold up the sky for a time if it meant the structure you loved didn't collapse. But in the chaos, in the way battles never respect the dignity of sacrifice, Luke's eyes found hers, and the smirk wavered into something sharper, something almost regretful, before the fight swallowed them both again. Zoe's arrows sang, Thalia's storm finally broke. Percy fought like the tide against the shore, relentless, inevitable, and at the last possible moment, the trap broke in reverse. Artemis freed, the general driven back. Luke retreating with the kind of calm that says this was only phase one. They stood on the peak together, bruised, bloody, breathing hard, the sky unburdened above them and the Pacific sprawling endless below. And in that fragile pause, Annabeth felt the truth settle in her bones. This war was no longer on the horizon. It was here, and every victory would be bought in minutes, in inches, in the choices made between friends who might not all live to see the blueprint completed. The labyrinth did not wait for them. It breathed for them, shifted for them, listened in the quiet between footsteps like an animal deciding whether to swallow or spare, and Annabeth felt it the moment she stepped through the entrance beneath the camp's training arena, the way the air folded in on itself, carrying the scent of old stone and something faintly metallic, as if the maze still remembered the tools that carved it. She'd studied Daedalus's work for years, tracing sketches by candlelight, mapping theories in the margins of books no one else had bothered to open, but knowing a thing and being in it were different. The walls here were alive, their patterns less geometric than instinctive, and each corridor was both an invitation and a warning. Percy's voice, low beside her, kept anchoring her back to the present, reminding her that they were here for a reason, to find Daedalus before Luke did, to secure the key to the maze and its passageways before the enemy could spill into Camp Half-Blood like water through a broken dam. But for Annabeth, the quest was heavier, personal, stitched with threads of rivalry and loyalty, and the ache of wanting to understand the mind of the man who had built something so beautiful and terrible. The labyrinth's tricks began early, corridors that led them back to where they'd started without a single turn, floors that tilted into staircases when they weren't looking, voices that belonged to no one, and each illusion cost them time, which in the maze was the same as distance lost. They met dangers like punctuation marks, Empuzai who laughed with voices like glass breaking, a forge heat chamber where Hephaestus himself set them a task under the glow of molten rivers, the occasional flicker of movement that might have been Luke's scouts, always just far enough away to vanish when pursued. And through it all, Annabeth felt the weight of leadership pressing in, not just giving orders, but deciding when not to, knowing that in a place where every step mattered, one wrong choice could mean they'd walk forever without reaching daylight again. Grover's ears twitched at sounds only he could hear, guiding them toward the faint hope of Pan's presence, and Tyson moved with an unexpected grace, his large hands sometimes steadying Annabeth when the ground tried to shift her footing. But it was in the moments between dangers, in the pockets of quiet where the maze's heartbeat was slow, that she felt it most, the pull towards something deeper, a truth hidden in stone and shadow, and a question she wasn't ready to ask. If they found Daedalus, what would she see in him? And what would she see of herself? They had been walking long enough for hours to blur into something shapeless, the labyrinth stretching and folding until Annabeth could no longer tell if they were descending deeper into the earth or climbing towards some impossible horizon, the air changing from dry and dusty to damp and cold, as if the maze itself were shifting climates in an effort to unsettle them. The torchlight from Percy's hand flickered against carvings that seemed to move when she wasn't looking, spirals curling into each other, patterns she recognized from Daedalus's blueprints, except here they pulsed faintly, like veins under skin. And the realization struck her that the maze wasn't just a creation, it was a living testament to its creator's mind, brilliant, paranoid, restless. When they stumbled into a vast chamber lit by a strange phosphorescent glow, Annabeth caught sight of the ceiling arched like a cathedral. But the light wasn't from flame. It came from veins of crystal embedded in the stone, humming softly, almost like they were listening. It was here they met Briars, the 100-handed one, cowering in the corner like a shadow too big for itself, his many arms wrapped tight around him in a prison of his own making. And Annabeth's heart ached for the stories she'd read of his strength and courage, now worn away by centuries of captivity and fear. Convincing him to join them was less about argument and more about reminding him who he had once been, and Annabeth found herself speaking words she didn't fully believe yet, telling him that even the most twisted paths had exits, that even the most wounded could still change the story they were in. And when he finally rose, towering over them, there was a flicker of the legend in his eyes. They pressed on, navigating traps that felt more like riddles than obstacles, until at last they reached the forge room of Daedalus himself, though it wasn't the inventor who greeted them. It was a mechanical man, all bronze joints and clicking gears, his voice tinny but layered with centuries of memory, telling them they were too late, that the maze had already chosen a side. Annabeth's mind worked furiously, mapping possibilities, trying to see the exit and the solution at once. But beneath her determination was a quiet dread, that in chasing Daedalus through his own creation, she might be stepping into the same isolation and obsession that had swallowed him whole, and that when the maze closed behind them for the last time, she wouldn't know if she'd walked out with a victory, or with something in her lost forever. The Battle of the Labyrinth had changed Annabeth in ways she couldn't fully explain, but she didn't have time to dwell on it, because by the next summer the war with the Titans was no longer something looming on the horizon. It was at the door, hammering to get in. Camp Half-Blood, the one place she had always counted on to be safe, was bracing for a siege, and she was no longer just the clever girl with the plans. She was the one expected to hold the walls together when everything else began to crack. When word came of Kronos' forces gathering, of Luke, her Luke, though she tried to deny the possessive weight in her thoughts, marching closer with the Titan Lord inside him, Annabeth felt the old ache rise again, but she swallowed it down, because strategy didn't have room for hesitation. She found herself poring over war maps in the big house late into the night, her fingers tracing lines of attack, recalling every lesson Chiron had taught her, every story her mother had whispered about the sieges of Athens and Troy. Her instincts told her that the fight wouldn't just be in the open fields. It would be in the minds of the campers, in their belief that they could still win. And so, while Percy trained with the younger campers, Annabeth walked the borders, checking the magical defenses, running drills with the Athena cabin until their shield formations were as sharp as a spear point. She had nightmares, visions of Luke's eyes shifting between the boy she'd known and the cold golden glare of Kronos, but she never spoke of them. Instead, she buried herself in preparation, as if the right plan could keep fate itself from claiming the people she loved. When the day of battle came, it arrived not with the blare of horns, but with a creeping tension in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. The enemy pushed through the labyrinth, erupting from tunnels in a surge of monsters and demigods twisted to Kronos' side. Annabeth fought like someone who had no choice but to win, because she didn't. Her dagger flashed, her shield intercepted blows meant for younger campers. Her voice cut through the chaos with orders that turned scattered resistance into coordinated strikes. But then came the breaking point. Percy, Grover, Tyson, and the others had returned from their mission with Daedalus, but there was no time for reunion. The Titan army surged again, and this time they brought the dragon. The bronze automaton roared as it crashed through the camp's defenses, fire spilling from its jaws, its metal hide nearly impenetrable. Annabeth knew that panic would be death here, so she forced herself to breathe, to see the machine as just another problem to solve. She spotted a weakness, the left hind leg, where one joint wasn't moving as smoothly as the rest, and with a series of shouted commands, she maneuvered the Athena cabin and the Hephaestus campers into position. The fight that followed was brutal and exhausting. Annabeth's arm ached from blocking blow after blow, and the heat from the dragon's flames seared her skin. But slowly, methodically, they dismantled the beast piece by piece until its head crashed to the ground with a metallic groan. The cheers were brief because the war wasn't over, but in that moment, Annabeth allowed herself a breath of relief. They had held the line for now. But as night fell and the healers tended to the wounded, she caught sight of a figure in the shadows beyond the camp's border, watching. She knew that silhouette better than anyone. Luke. For a heartbeat, their eyes met, and she hoped. She saw a flicker of the boy she'd once trusted with her life. Then he was gone, swallowed by the dark, and the ache in her chest returned, heavier than before. That night, Annabeth sat alone at the shoreline, the sound of the waves a low, steady rhythm under her thoughts. She knew the battle had only delayed the inevitable. Kronos would come again, stronger. And when he did, Luke would be with him. She tried to picture the moment they'd meet on the battlefield, tried to imagine raising her dagger against him, but the image refused to settle. Instead, she remembered the boy who had carried her through the woods, who had told her she'd be a great architect someday. She hated herself for clinging to that memory, but she couldn't let it go. In the days that followed, she threw herself into repairing the camp, into reinforcing defenses, into building alliances wherever she could. But there was one truth she couldn't shake. No matter how many walls she built, no matter how many plans she drew, the war would find its way inside. And when it did, the battle wouldn't just be fought with swords, it would be fought in her heart. That was the curse of being a daughter of Athena. She could see every possible outcome, every path the war might take, and she knew that in all but the smallest number of them, someone she loved would not make it to the end. And yet, she kept planning, because that's what Annabeth Chase did. She found the thread of hope, however thin, and she wove it into something worth fighting for. The weeks after the battle at Camp Half-Blood blurred together into a rhythm of repairs, training, and restless nights. But beneath it all, Annabeth could feel the pull of something greater, the final war taking shape. The signs were everywhere, monsters reforming faster than they could be slain, whispers of demigods abandoning their cabins to join Kronos, the sea itself seeming unsettled, as if Poseidon's realm was bracing for a storm it could not hold back. And then, almost without warning, the storm broke. Word came that Kronos' forces were gathering in Manhattan, and the gods themselves were distracted, lured away to fight the monster Typhon as he tore across the American heartland. It was a strategy so audacious that Annabeth could almost admire it. Almost. With Olympus unguarded, the city was vulnerable, and it fell to the demigods to stand between Kronos and the destruction of the god's seat of power. The Athena cabin took point on logistics. Annabeth mapped choke points, supply lines, fallback positions, and defensive barricades across Manhattan with the precision of a chess master, placing each piece for a final stand. But this wasn't just a battle plan. This was personal. She knew Luke would be there. She knew the moment was coming when there would be no choice but to face him. As the campers marched into the city, Annabeth walked at the front, her dagger strapped to her side, her mind racing through every possible maneuver. The streets were eerily quiet at first, the hum of traffic replaced by the distant rumble of monsters closing in. They fortified the Empire State Building, Olympus's mortal world anchor, with makeshift barricades and traps. But the real fight began in the streets. Dresini, hellhounds, and Empusi surged through the avenues, and the demigods met them in a series of running battles, retreating by inches toward their stronghold. Annabeth fought with a calm born of necessity, every strike calculated, every order shouted to maximize survival. But war is chaos, and even the best-laid plans fray under its weight. At the Williamsburg Bridge, she found herself cut off with a small group of campers, holding the line against a wave of monsters far larger than they could handle. Her shield arm went numb from the impacts, and her lungs burned with the effort. But she refused to yield. Then a cry went up. The bridge was rigged to collapse, a desperate move to keep Kronos' army from flanking them. The order came to fall back, but Annabeth was the last to move, covering the retreat until the structure shuddered and dropped into the river with a roar. That night, they regrouped at the base of the Empire State Building, battered but unbroken. She knew they couldn't hold forever, and that knowledge ate at her. When Kronos' main force finally arrived, it was like watching a tide of darkness roll down Fifth Avenue, swallowing everything in its path. And at the center of it, clad in golden armor, was Luke, or rather the thing wearing Luke's face. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, the battle around them vanished. Annabeth stepped forward, dagger in hand, and in that moment, it was just the two of them. Friends, rivals, almost somethings, now standing on opposite sides of the end of the world. Kronos spoke with Luke's mouth, his voice like a blade drawn across stone, taunting her about the futility of resistance. But Annabeth didn't answer with words. She attacked, feinting left, striking right, forcing him back in a blur of motion. She wasn't trying to kill him, not yet. She was buying time, trying to reach the part of him that might still be in there. The fight raged through the lobby, up the stairs, onto the observation deck, each clash bringing her closer to the truth. Luke was still fighting, somewhere deep inside, but Kronos' grip was strong. Then came the moment that would haunt her forever. Percy and the others had joined the battle, and the tide was turning. But not enough. They couldn't kill Kronos without killing Luke. And then Annabeth remembered something, the promise Luke had made to her years ago when they'd first run away together. "Family," he'd said. "We'll always be family. You're my little sister." She shouted it at him now, in the middle of the chaos, not as a taunt, but as a lifeline. And for a split second, it worked. Luke's eyes cleared, just enough for him to wrest control from the Titan Lord. The rest unfolded in a blur. Luke, mortally wounded, choosing to end it himself rather than let Kronos win, Percy handing him the dagger, Annabeth kneeling beside him as the life drained from his face. She held his hand until the last breath left him, and in that moment, all the battles, all the strategy, all the years of trying to save him collapsed into one truth. She had lost her oldest friend. When it was over and the war was won, Annabeth didn't feel victorious. She felt hollow, as if some vital piece of her had been carved away. Olympus stood, the gods returned, and her name was spoken with respect and gratitude by beings she had idolized her whole life. But all she could think about was the promise she couldn't keep, the boy she couldn't save. In the days that followed, she wandered the rebuilt streets of Manhattan like a ghost, overseeing the cleanup, helping rebuild what had been broken. But inside, she was adrift. It wasn't until she stood again on the roof of the Empire State Building, looking out over the city she had defended, that she allowed herself to cry. Not the controlled tears of a strategist mourning her losses, but the raw, unrestrained grief of a girl who had been asked to bear too much, too young. And yet, even then, somewhere beneath the grief, there was resolve. Luke's sacrifice had bought them this peace, and she would honor it by making sure the world they had saved was worth the cost. When the dust of the Titan War finally settled, and the roar of battle faded into the distance like a storm, retreating over an endless horizon, Annabeth Chase stood at the heart of Olympus with her heart still racing, her hair tangled from smoke and wind, her clothes still torn from the fight, and yet her mind was already moving in lines and shapes, towers and archways, maps and blueprints only she could see, because to Annabeth, even ruin had a pattern, and even destruction could be the beginning of something greater. The city of the gods had survived, but it was wounded. Whole blocks of marble temples cracked open like shells. Colossal statues of Olympian deities lying broken across plazas that smelled of ash. Golden streets split and jagged as though lightning itself had scarred them. And in that moment, as other demigods stumbled in exhaustion, and the gods themselves argued in loud, echoing voices about honors and punishments, Annabeth felt a stillness inside her, a quiet certainty that her part of the war wasn't over. Not yet, because this was her chance to build, to shape something that would outlast any prophecy. She approached the throne room, its massive doors hanging crooked on their hinges, and stepped carefully over the fractured mosaics to stand before the assembled Olympians, her grey eyes bright not with fear but with purpose, and when she spoke her voice did not waver. She told them that if Olympus was to be more than a symbol, if it was to truly stand as a home for gods and heroes alike, it had to be rebuilt not just in image, but in spirit, with strength and unity woven into its design. Some gods looked amused, others insulted at the boldness of a mortal child speaking so directly. But Athena's gaze was unreadable, a mask of both pride and scrutiny, and Zeus, sitting on his crackling throne, studied her as if weighing the lightning bolt in his hand against the blueprint in her mind. And somehow, whether out of respect for her part in saving Olympus, or the sheer inevitability in her tone, they agreed not just to repair the city, but to let Annabeth lead the redesign, to give her the title of Architect of Olympus, an honor so rare for a mortal that it felt almost like an unspoken adoption into the divine. And from that day forward, her life took on a new rhythm, not of quests and battles, but of plans and creation. She would wake in a room at Camp Half-Blood with rolls of parchment and jars of ink scattered around her bed, sketches of new fortifications for the gods, bridges between temples, gardens that would soften the marble with green life, and she traveled often to Olympus, climbing the endless shimmering stairs with a satchel full of tools, stepping into a world above the clouds, where workers of celestial bronze hammered at beams, naiads carried water to fountains, and cyclops carved pillars taller than mortal skyscrapers, all under her direction. Yet even in this work, shadows lingered at the edges, for rebuilding Olympus also meant navigating the politics of gods, who often changed their minds or disagreed with her designs, and there were days when she would walk the empty streets at dawn, watching mist curl around broken archways not yet restored, feeling the weight of expectation on her shoulders, knowing that if she failed, it wouldn't just be marble that crumbled, but the fragile peace they had bought with so much blood. During this time, her bond with Percy deepened in new ways no longer forged in the constant heat of battle, but in quiet moments stolen between her projects and his return to camp life. Afternoons spent walking the shoreline, evenings where they would sit under the stars and she would read her blueprints aloud as if they were stories, letting him imagine the world she was building, and though she never said it outright, there was comfort in knowing he believed in her vision as much as she did, even when the gods questioned it. The work went on for months, each temple restored or redesigned with subtle improvements, each street realigned to form patterns visible only from the sky, each plaza given places where demigods could walk without feeling small among immortal grandeur. And when the final piece was placed, a great bronze sundial in the central square, its shadow falling across the names of heroes who had fought and fallen, Annabeth stood back and felt, for the first time in years, a sense of completion. But peace, as she had learned long ago, never stayed forever, and as the last celebrations died down, whispers of a new unrest began to drift through camp. Rumors of Roman demigods, of a world beyond her maps, and Annabeth knew deep down that her role as architect might soon mean more than building walls. It might mean bridging worlds that had been kept apart for centuries. But if Annabeth had learned anything from the years she'd spent chasing monsters, solving ancient riddles, and standing between prophecy and disaster, it was that every finished design is just a new beginning in disguise. And as she watched the sunlight break through the clouds over Olympus, casting long gold shadows across the marble she had rebuilt, she felt that old itch in her mind, the awareness that stability never lasts in a world where gods hold grudges and monsters reform from dust. Her instincts were proven right far sooner than she'd hoped, for it was during one of her routine visits to adjust the layout of the amphitheater gardens that she overheard Hermes and Athena speaking in urgent clipped tones about the other camp and a storm crossing the old boundaries, words that prickled down her spine because they spoke of a larger world that the Olympians had always kept partitioned. And suddenly the clean, orderly lines of her city felt like fragile glass waiting to crack. That night she stayed on Olympus, unable to sleep, pacing the narrow balconies above the city, staring out at a horizon she could not see, wondering if this was what her mother had meant when she said architecture was not just about building structures, but preparing for the weight they would carry. And before dawn, she made her decision. She would not wait for whatever was coming to shatter her work. She would learn its shape and meet it halfway. The first step was research, and Annabeth threw herself into it with the same relentless focus she'd once used to decode the labyrinth, spending days in the Olympian libraries, climbing ladders taller than most mortal buildings to reach scrolls that smelled of dust and cedar, unrolling brittle parchments that spoke of treaties, rival pantheons, and a long-forgotten place called Camp Jupiter, each clue tightening the knot of tension in her chest. Percy noticed her distraction when she returned to camp, and though she didn't tell him everything not yet, she let him walk with her by the lake in the evenings, their conversations drifting between her architectural frustrations and the strange patterns she'd started noticing in the way certain monsters were appearing, almost as if they were probing the edges of a map she hadn't drawn. Weeks passed, and Annabeth's duties as architect took on a double life. By day, she oversaw restorations and additions to Olympus, working alongside Cyclops who could lift columns like toothpicks and dryads, who coaxed living vines to wrap the base of statues, while by night she traced lines of connection between her blueprints and the ancient Roman schematics she'd found, sketching possibilities in the margins as though she were planning a bridge no one had yet approved. Tension began to ripple through the gods themselves. Some, like Athena and Apollo, seemed willing to discuss the Romans, while others, like Ares and Hera, treated the subject as a provocation, and Annabeth became keenly aware that her position was not immune to the politics of immortals. There were days she returned to Camp Half-Blood feeling wrung dry, her hands stained with charcoal from long hours of sketching, only to have her ideas questioned or delayed by divine egos. But she pressed on, driven by something deeper than orders or honors, the belief that architecture could be more than buildings, that it could create space for peace before war had the chance to erupt. Then came the message that changed everything. A dream so vivid it felt less like a vision and more like standing awake in another place. A city not of marble, but of stone, its streets lined with banners in imperial purple, its gates guarded by soldiers whose faces were both familiar and strange. And in the center, a figure she could not quite see but somehow knew was waiting for her. When she woke, her heart was pounding. Her hand still curled, as if it had been holding a tool, and she realized the blueprint she'd been searching for wasn't made of walls or towers. It was a path, a connection, a way to bring two worlds together before they collided. In the days that followed, Annabeth worked faster than ever, finalizing the last touches on Olympus, as if sealing a chapter of her life. Each completed project a goodbye she couldn't voice, because she knew that once she stepped off the gleaming stairs for the last time, the title Architect of Olympus might become a relic of the past. On the morning she left, the city shimmered behind her in the sunlight, its spires sharp against the clouds, the great sundial casting its shadow across the engraved names. And for a moment she let herself believe that it would stand, that her work would hold even if she never returned. Then she descended, each step carrying her closer to the sea where Percy would be waiting. And though she didn't know exactly where the next road would lead, she carried with her the tools that mattered most, her mind, her courage, and the unshakable certainty that whatever came next, she would meet it not just as a daughter of Athena, but as the builder of bridges no map had ever shown. And with that, Section 6 closes not in the marble halls of Olympus, but at the threshold of a greater journey, the first whispers of the Roman world stirring like distant thunder, leading us straight into the heart of the next chapter, a crossing not of oceans or mountains, but of legacies. The road to Camp Jupiter was not a single road at all, but a layered echo of every path Annabeth had ever taken, each mile laced with memories of quests past, the smell of pine from Camp Half-Blood, the salt snap of sea air that reminded her of long nights on the Argo II, the hum of distant traffic when she and Percy had walked through mortal cities, pretending they weren't carrying the weight of myth on their shoulders. But this time, the road was not hers alone. It was a corridor between two worlds that had never been meant to touch, and every step forward felt like tracing the first pencil line on a blueprint that could either become a bridge or a fault line. Percy was beside her, his presence grounding her when the silence of the journey grew too heavy, and though neither of them spoke much in the first days, Annabeth could tell he felt it too, the awareness that they were moving towards something larger than a quest, something that might redraw the boundaries of the demigod world forever. The Roman roads themselves seemed to know their purpose, ancient stones stretching endlessly in perfect straight lines, each segment fitted so precisely it might have been carved yesterday. The kind of craftsmanship Annabeth admired even as it made her wary, because perfection like this was never just aesthetic, it was power, and the Romans wielded it with intent. At night, they camped on the edges of those roads, their firelight catching the faint carved marks in the stone, Latin inscriptions weathered but not erased, names of legions and victories that reminded Annabeth of the difference between the Greeks' chaotic heroism and the Romans' ordered discipline. Sometimes she would wake in the small hours and find Percy staring into the darkness, his jaw tight, as if he could feel the ghosts of soldiers marching past. And she would reach for his hand without words, the contact saying what neither of them could voice, that they had walked through too many wars to ignore the one this road was leading them toward. The closer they came, the more the landscape shifted. Hills rose in smooth, deliberate curves. Fields were divided into neat, purposeful grids, and the air carried the distant sound of horns, not like the chaotic cries of Greek battle, but in patterns, rhythms, commands. On the fourth day, they crossed a bridge of such scale and precision that Annabeth stopped in her tracks, running her hand along the smooth cut of the stones, tracing the way the arches bore the weight so effortlessly, it felt like the bridge had been grown rather than built. Percy teased her for geeking out, but his voice was softer than usual, almost protective, and she caught him glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to be watched, a habit that proved justified when, that night, they found the first sign they were no longer just travelers. An eagle standard planted in the dirt near their camp. No soldier in sight, but the symbol gleaming in the moonlight like a warning. Annabeth recognized it instantly, SPQR, the mark of Rome, and though she pretended to focus on brushing ash from her hands, her mind was already calculating possibilities. Either they had been allowed to see it, or they had been tested, and both options meant the Romans knew they were coming. The next morning, the road narrowed as it climbed into the hills, and that was when they saw the first patrol, not the ragtag scouting party she was used to from Greek quests, but a precise armored unit moving in formation, their shields catching the early light in a uniform flash. Percy's hand brushed the pen in his pocket, but Annabeth shook her head, stepping forward with her palms visible, letting the morning sun light her face so they could see she wasn't hiding. The leader, a young woman with sharp eyes and a scar across her jaw, studied them for a long, silent moment before nodding once and motioning for them to follow. They did, and as they walked, Annabeth noticed the rhythm of the soldiers' steps, the way even their turns were executed without wasted motion, and she realized that this was not just a different camp, it was a different philosophy, one where the individual bent to the will of the whole, where heroes were not celebrated for breaking the rules, but for upholding them. The gates of Camp Jupiter loomed ahead by midday, taller than any fortification at Camp Half-Blood, the wood bound in bronze and carved with reliefs that told the history of the 12 tables, the founding of Rome, and battles fought far from the Greek imagination. Beyond those gates lay a city, not a camp streets paved with stone, aqueducts carrying water through the air in perfect arcs, villas and training grounds and markets, all arranged with mathematical precision. Annabeth's breath caught, not because it was beautiful in the Greek sense, but because it was functional, designed for survival, and she could see the mind behind it, a mind like hers, but trained in another tradition, one that valued order above improvisation. The Praetor's Hall stood at the heart of it all, flanked by banners in imperial purple, and it was there they were led, past curious eyes and whispers that followed them like the rustle of laurel leaves. The praetors themselves were an image of contrast. One, a boy with the easy posture of someone used to command. The other, a girl whose gaze flicked over Annabeth and Percy like she was measuring their worth in real time. Introductions were brief, and the questions came faster than Annabeth expected about their journey, their purpose, their loyalties, each one laced with the unspoken understanding that the answers would decide not just their welcome, but the fate of whatever alliance they hoped to forge. Annabeth chose her words carefully, speaking not as a supplicant, but as an equal, framing her role as architect of Olympus not as a title, but as proof she understood the weight of building something meant to last. She saw the flicker of interest in the praetor's eyes at that, and pressed her advantage, hinting at the shared threats they faced without revealing more than she had to. By the time they were dismissed, the tension in the room had shifted, still guarded, but no longer hostile, and as they stepped back into the sunlight, Percy let out a low breath he'd been holding since they passed through the gates. They were offered quarters in one of the guest villas, and though Annabeth accepted, she knew the real test had not yet begun. Alliances were not made in formal meetings, but in the quiet spaces between them, and she intended to learn every pattern, every strength, and every weakness in this camp before the Romans decided what to do with their Greek visitors. That night, lying on a narrow but well-made bed, she listened to the camp settle into its routines, the change of guard, the distant call of the watch horns, the measured murmur of patrols passing under her window, and she realized that while the Greeks thrived in chaos, the Romans found comfort in constancy. If she was going to bridge these two worlds, she would have to learn to walk both rhythms without losing her own. And as she drifted toward sleep, the image of the road that had brought them here lingered in her mind, its perfect, unbroken lines stretching into the unknown, daring her to follow it to whatever lay at its end. Annabeth woke before dawn on her second day at Camp Jupiter, drawn from sleep not by noise, but by the stillness. The kind of ordered quiet that came from a place running exactly as it was meant to, where even the night hours had structure. Outside her window, the faint silver of early morning was just touching the rooftops, and she could see the silhouettes of sentries along the walls, each one moving in a perfect loop that reminded her of gears in a machine. And she thought again about the challenge before her, to step into this world without being swallowed by it. Breakfast was served in the forum, long tables where cohorts sat together in their armor, conversation low but efficient, with no wasted time on gossip or distraction. Percy looked slightly out of place in the disciplined rows, his easy grin earning him wary glances from some and reluctant smirks from others. But Annabeth kept her focus on observation the way the cohorts were arranged by seniority. The subtle signals passed between centurions, the quiet nod from a praetor when an order had been followed without needing to be spoken. It was a language of structure, and she was fluent in enough languages to know she could learn this one if she listened long enough. The day's schedule was posted at the edge of the forum: training drills, tactical exercises, maintenance of fortifications, and though guests were not required to participate, Annabeth volunteered without hesitation, knowing that words would not convince the Romans of her worth as much as action. The first drill was a shield wall formation, and while her Greek instincts urged her to break formation for a flanking move, she forced herself to hold the line, matching her steps to the soldier beside her, letting the rhythm of the whole take precedence over her own. By the end of the exercise, the centurion's nod was almost imperceptible, but it was there, and that was enough to tell her she had passed the first, smallest test. In the afternoons, she walked the camp under the guise of familiarizing herself, but every step was a study. The way the barracks were positioned for rapid mobilization, the storage facilities designed to keep supplies within arm's reach of the walls, the quiet reverence given to the field of Mars, where statues of past heroes stood in solemn lines. Each detail told her something about the Roman mindset: efficiency, endurance, unity, and she began to sketch the mental blueprint of how such a camp could stand against any force, mortal or divine. That night, a message came. She was to join a small scouting party beyond the walls at first light, not as a leader, but as an observer. The mission was simple survey, a section of the old Roman roads that had been reported as showing signs of monster activity, but Annabeth knew the simplicity was a test. The next morning, armed, but not over-armed, she set out with 5 legionnaires, their formation tight, their eyes scanning in sync. She matched their pace, kept her voice low, and when the first signs of trouble appeared, a set of clawed tracks veering off the road into the brush. She didn't rush ahead, but gestured for the point soldier to investigate, earning a brief, approving glance from the party's leader. The tracks led to an old milestone marker, its inscription half buried in moss, and from the shadows beyond came the unmistakable glint of eyes. The fight was short, but precise. The Romans moved like one organism, and Annabeth slipped into their timing, her dagger striking in the exact moment the gap in the enemy's defense opened. When it was over, and the last monster dissolved into dust, one of the legionnaires clapped her shoulder not warmly, but with the acknowledgement of a comrade, and that meant more in this place than any verbal praise. Over the next weeks, the tests continued. Each one layered a construction project where she was given only Roman tools, a tactical puzzle where the goal was to defend a mock fortress using their methods, even a negotiation with a group of fauns that required her to speak as a Roman diplomat rather than a Greek envoy. Each challenge taught her more about them, but also about herself, about the adaptability that had always been her greatest strength. And yet, beneath the growing mutual respect, Annabeth could feel the tension, the unspoken question of what would happen when the Greeks and Romans finally stood side by side, or worse, across from each other. She saw it in the way some younger legionnaires stiffened at the mention of Camp Half-Blood, in the way certain orders from the praetors carried a subtle edge when she and Percy were present, in the way whispers would pause as she passed by. It all came to a head one evening when she was summoned to the praetors' hall again, this time alone. The discussion began formally updates on her integration, her performance in drills, but soon shifted, the questions sharper. Did she truly believe Greeks and Romans could fight together? Was she prepared to follow Roman command if the need arose? And most importantly, could she put aside personal ties if they conflicted with the greater good of the legion? Annabeth answered with measured honesty, knowing that to give them platitudes would be worse than refusing to answer at all. She spoke of the threats they both faced, of the gods' fickle nature, of the times she had seen alliances forged in fire and desperation. She did not say she trusted them completely, because she didn't. But she made it clear she trusted in the necessity of what they were building. The praetor leaned back, studying her for a long moment, then dismissed her with the smallest of smiles, a Roman smile restrained, but real. In the weeks that followed, her place in the camp shifted. She was no longer just a guest, but not quite a legionnaire, something in between, a bridge being built stone by stone. Percy, too, found his rhythm here, and though the two of them rarely had time alone, when they did, it was often in the quiet of the aqueducts at night, the sound of water flowing above them like a reminder that every structure, no matter how strong, was always in motion. Annabeth found herself sketching again, drawing not just buildings but maps of roads connecting the Greek and Roman worlds, of fortified positions that could serve both, of a shared future that felt fragile but possible. And when at last the summons came for them to leave their time at Camp Jupiter complete for now, their path turning toward the next challenge, she walked once more down the Roman road, the camp behind her, the horizon ahead, and she knew that this stretch of her journey had not been about proving herself to them, or them to her, but about learning the weight of the road itself, the discipline to walk it, the vision to see where it could lead, and the courage to keep moving forward, even when every mile was an act of faith. The journey from Camp Jupiter back into the wider world was not a triumphant march, but a quiet departure, marked less by farewells than by the sound of gates closing behind them. And though Annabeth had walked away from many places in her life, the weight in her chest told her this one mattered in ways she could not yet define. The Roman roads gave way to wild stretches where the ancient order of stone and mile markers dissolved into the chaos of untamed land. And it was in that shifting landscape that the prophecy returned to her mind, the words that had been echoing since before she even reached the Roman camp, the ones that spoke of trials that would break her or make her, the ones she hadn't dared repeat aloud for fear that speaking them might fix them into inevitability. Percy walked beside her, the easy rhythm of his stride almost enough to distract her from the tension building beneath her thoughts, but not quite. She knew the peace between their camps was a thread stretched thin, and she could feel it trembling under the weight of things yet to come. Their path led them north, toward cities where mortal life bustled above ancient ruins, where the mist clung to alleyways and old stones whispered of gods who had not been worshipped for centuries, but had never truly left. It was in one such city, a place where the shadow of the Acropolis fell across both modern streets and buried temples, that Annabeth felt it. A pull, not physical, but bone deep, like the invisible line of a compass needle snapping toward true north. She didn't tell Percy right away. Instead, she let herself be drawn through narrow streets until they came to a set of weathered steps descending beneath a marketplace, their edges worn by thousands of years of feet, mortal and immortal alike. The air grew cooler as they descended, the hum of the city above fading into the kind of silence that felt alive. At the base of the steps was a door, simple, wooden, impossibly out of place, and when she touched it, the wood shifted under her hand like something breathing. A voice spoke then, not aloud but inside her head, smooth and precise. "Daughter of wisdom, your road bends here." She glanced at Percy, but his expression told her he had heard nothing. "Wait here," she said, though she knew he wouldn't like it, and when the door opened under her hand, she stepped through into darkness. Inside was a chamber that was not a chamber space stretched too far, the air smelling faintly of parchment and olive oil, the shadows shifting as though lit by a fire she could not see. A figure emerged, cloaked in white, its face hidden, but the voice was unmistakable. Not her mother, not exactly, but an echo of Athena's mind, given form. It spoke of a test one that no map could guide her through, one that required her to lay down every weapon but the one she trusted least, her heart. She was to recover something long thought lost, the Palladium, a relic from the dawn of the god's reign, a statue whose presence once protected entire cities from invasion, and whose disappearance had left a fracture in the mortal and immortal worlds alike. The relic was hidden in a labyrinth that was not the labyrinth she had known. This one existed between layers of reality, its walls shifting with thought and memory, its paths shaped by the choices of the one who walked them. And here was the catch. She could not bring Percy or anyone else. To succeed, she would have to walk it alone. Annabeth's mind raced through possibilities, weighing risk against necessity. but the figure offered no further detail, only a warning. Each wrong turn in the labyrinth would cost her something she could not regain. When she stepped back through the wooden door into the dim light of the steps, Percy was waiting, his brows drawn in concern, and she told him only enough to keep him from following, not because she didn't trust him, but because she knew that this was hers to bear. That night, she left the inn they'd found, her pack light, her dagger at her side, and followed the mental thread that pulled her toward the labyrinth's entrance. It was not in a ruin or a temple, but beneath a quiet olive grove on the edge of the city, where the grass grew in patterns that shifted when she looked away. The entrance was a crack in the air itself, no wider than her hand. But when she stepped through, it unfolded into a corridor of stone that pulsed faintly, like the walls themselves were alive. The first challenge came quickly, a fork in the path, where each direction seemed identical, yet the air to her left carried the scent of home, and the air to her right the faintest trace of smoke. She chose the right, knowing that comfort was often the quickest path to failure. The corridor twisted into a spiral that narrowed until she had to turn sideways to pass, the walls brushing her shoulders, and then it opened into a chamber where the floor was a mosaic of broken mirrors. Each shard reflected not her face, but moments from her life, some real, some twisted, some she wished she could forget. She forced herself not to linger, stepping carefully until she reached the far side, where another archway waited. Beyond it was a staircase that seemed to descend forever, each step taking her not deeper but further back. She recognized the architecture shifting around her, styles from centuries past, languages carved into the walls that she had only ever seen in books. At last, she reached a door carved with an owl's face, its eyes set with stones that gleamed in the torchlight. She reached for the handle, but it vanished, the door melting into mist, and a voice spoke again, not Athena's echo this time, but her own, sharp with doubt. What if your wisdom fails you? What if you are only what they made you to be? The question rattled her, because it was one she had asked herself in quieter moments, in the spaces between quests when there was nothing to distract her from the truth that she had been raised, in many ways, as a weapon for her mother's ambitions. But she pushed forward, through the mist, into another corridor, the air colder now, the light dimmer. She could feel the labyrinth shifting with her thoughts, testing her, trying to force her into a choice that would reveal her flaws. The next challenge was not physical, but emotional. A hall lined with doors, each opening into a memory of someone she loved. Percy, Grover, her friends at Camp Half-Blood, and in each vision they called to her, needing her help. She knew instinctively that stepping through any of them would trap her, that the labyrinth was feeding on her desire to protect them. It took every ounce of her will to turn away from the voices and keep moving. Hours, or perhaps days' time, had no meaning here passed before she reached the center. The Palladium stood on a pedestal of white marble, smaller than she expected, its form simple, unadorned, but the air around it thrummed with power. She stepped forward, hand outstretched, and the floor dropped away. She caught herself on the edge, dangling over an abyss where no bottom was visible, the statue still just out of reach. From the shadows, something moved, a guardian, its form shifting between wolf, serpent, and crow, its eyes burning with the same light as the Palladium. It spoke in riddles, each one designed to force her into revealing the shape of her own fears, and she answered each with care, drawing not just on logic, but on the lessons she had learned in the years since she first left home. At last, the guardian stepped aside, and she pulled herself onto the pedestal, taking the palladium into her hands. The moment she did, the labyrinth began to collapse, its walls folding in on themselves, the path back twisting into nothing. She ran, guided not by sight, but by the same instinct that had led her here. And when she burst back into the olive grove, the sun was just beginning to rise. The world still and unchanged, except for the weight in her hands, and the knowledge that she had passed a test no one else could have taken for her. Annabeth stood in the olive grove, the dawn breeze cooling the sweat on her face, the palladium cradled in her hands as if it might dissolve into mist if she loosened her grip. And though part of her wanted to simply sink to the grass and breathe, she knew the relic's return to the mortal world would not go unnoticed. Already the air felt heavier, charged with the awareness of something ancient waking from a long slumber. And in the shifting light of early morning, she thought she saw faint silhouettes moving at the edges of the grove shapes, too still to be mortals, too indistinct to name. She hid the palladium in her pack beneath her spare clothes and made her way back toward the city, moving quickly but without drawing attention, replaying every step of the labyrinth in her mind, not out of nostalgia, but to analyze the test, to understand what Athena's echo and perhaps the goddess herself had truly been measuring. Percy was waiting when she returned to the inn, and though he tried to mask it, his relief was plain in the way his shoulders eased when she walked through the door. She told him only that she had found what she was sent for, leaving out the details that would only give him another reason to worry, and by nightfall they were already on the road again, heading east toward a rendezvous point that Chiron had set weeks earlier. It was during that journey, in the shadow of a mountain pass where the wind carried whispers from nowhere, that the first attempt to take the relic came a band of Empusai, their glamour flickering as they moved between mortal invisibility and their true forms, their eyes fixed not on her, but on the pack slung over her shoulder. The fight was fast, brutal, and left her with a cut along her arm where one had slashed through her jacket, but the palladium remained safe. Yet that attack was only the beginning. Word had spread quickly through the immortal world, and with it came the predators. Destinies lurking at river crossings, a telkine that rose from the foam of a stormy beach, even a mortal thief whose mind had been twisted by the promise of a reward from an unseen patron. Each encounter forced her to think faster, to blend her mother's gift for strategy with the practical lessons she had learned in the field, that sometimes the best move wasn't the cleverest, but the one that got you and your friends out alive. It was during a quiet campfire stop, days later, that the second part of the test revealed itself, not in some grand pronouncement, but in the way the world seemed to warp at the edges when she set the palladium down beside her bedroll. In dreams, she saw flashes of cities under siege, of walls crumbling, of armies held at bay by an invisible shield, and in every vision, the statue glowed faintly at the city's heart. She began to understand that this was not simply a relic of the gods' glory days, but a tether, binding the safety of mortal civilization to divine will. The longer she carried it, the more the dreams pressed at her, showing her paths where the relic could be used to fortify Olympus, to shield Camp Half-Blood and Camp Jupiter forever, but also paths where it could be hidden from both gods and monsters, breaking that chain and letting mortals stand on their own. This, she realized with a cold clarity one night, was the real test, not retrieving the relic, but deciding its fate. By the time they reached the rendezvous point, a cliffside over the sea where Chiron waited in centaur form, the wind pulling at his cloak, Annabeth had made her choice, though it burned in her chest to speak it. She handed the palladium to Chiron without ceremony, her fingers lingering on its smooth surface for a heartbeat before she let go, and told him that it must be hidden where neither gods nor demigods could claim it as a weapon. Chiron did not argue, though the weight in his gaze told her he understood the risk of defying divine expectation. Instead, he promised to see it done. That night, as they camped under the stars, Percy asked her why she hadn't kept it for Olympus, and she told him the truth, that some shields, no matter how strong, could become cages if left in the wrong hands. The words felt heavier than they should have, because she knew they were also about her, about the life she had been groomed for, the expectations she had carried since she was 7, the constant push to be perfect, to be her mother's daughter in all ways that mattered. In passing the test, she had not simply proven her wisdom, she had claimed the right to define it for herself. When they left the cliffside the next morning, the sea glittering below them and the wind filling their sails as they crossed back into open waters, she felt lighter, though the road ahead was still uncertain. The dreams faded over the next week, but every so often she would catch herself glancing toward the horizon, wondering if the palladium still stood where Chiron had taken it, still quietly protecting some unseen city, or if in some way she could not yet understand it was protecting her. The war would come soon enough, and when it did, she knew this choice would be one of the many that shaped its outcome. A decision born not of prophecy or divine command, but of her own mind and heart, working together the truest test a daughter of wisdom could ever face. The morning the final war began was not marked by a trumpet blast or a divine sign in the clouds, but by an uncanny stillness, a quiet that seemed to stretch across the world, as if the air itself were holding its breath. And Annabeth felt it the moment she opened her eyes in the small coastal inn where they had stopped the night before, that subtle shift when the waiting ends and the storm begins. She had been through battles before, skirmishes and quests that had felt life or death in the moment. But this was different. This was the war that prophecy had whispered about for years, the one that had shadowed every victory with the knowledge that it was only a temporary reprieve. The call to arms came not from a god, but from Campa's demigods riding Pegasi along the shoreline, their faces set and voices urgent. The enemy was on the move, gathering near Manhattan, the heart of Olympus itself. By midday, Annabeth, Percy, and a dozen others were in the thick of preparations, securing armor, sharpening weapons, reviewing the battle plan that she had helped draft months ago, one that accounted for the enemy's likely strategies, fallback routes, and choke points. Yet, for all her meticulous planning, she knew that no plan survived first contact with chaos, and war was chaos distilled. They reached Manhattan under a sky smeared with gray, the skyline already showing signs of the enemy's advance, plumes of smoke curling from distant streets, flashes of bronze and gold where celestial bronze met celestial bronze. Olympus shimmered faintly above the Empire State Building, its golden spires both a beacon and a target. The streets below had been cleared of mortals thanks to the mist, but the silence of empty avenues only made the approaching roar of the enemy forces more ominous. Annabeth took her position on the western flank, directing a mix of Greek and Roman demigods, hunters of Artemis, and a few nature spirits who had sworn to defend the city. The first wave came fast, Draceni phalanx, Empusai darting between them, Cyclops smashing through parked cars like toys. She moved like the strategist she was, calling orders, shifting units, anticipating where the line would buckle, and when it did, she was there. Blade flashing, shield locking against a spear meant for a younger camper. Hours blurred into a rhythm of attack and retreat, the clang of weapons, the scream of monsters dissolving into dust, the jarring moments when a friend went down and there was no time to stop. Percy fought like the sea incarnate beside her, but even his strength could not hold back every tide. By nightfall, both sides had taken heavy losses, and the enemy had secured a foothold near the base of the Empire State Building, forcing Annabeth to order a fallback to the plaza, where they could regroup. It was there, in the eerie glow of street lamps and firelight, that she received word of the enemy's champion. A giant, bred from the earth itself, blessed by the primordial powers that opposed the gods, wielding a weapon forged to shatter divine defenses. If he reached Olympus, the war would be lost before dawn. Annabeth didn't hesitate. With Percy, Thalia, and Nico at her side, she set out under cover of darkness to intercept him before he breached the final perimeter. The streets they crossed were littered with the aftermath of battle weapons abandoned. Scorch marks on the asphalt, drifts of monster dust catching in the wind. When they found him, the giant was crossing the Manhattan Bridge, his strides long enough to carry him halfway across in minutes, the weapon on his shoulder gleaming with a sickly, unnatural light. The fight that followed was brutal and desperate. Every strike he landed sent shockwaves through the concrete. Every block she made rattled her arm to the bone, but Annabeth fought with the clarity of someone who understood the stakes, darting in to slash at tendons, feinting to draw his attention so Percy could summon waves that battered him from the side. Thalia's arrows found their mark. Nico's shadows tangled his legs, and still he pressed on. It was Annabeth who saw the weakness, the faint hairline crack in the weapon's haft, and without pausing to explain, she vaulted up onto his arm, driving her dagger into the floor with every ounce of strength she had. The weapon shattered with a sound like a thunderclap. The giant howled, and Percy's final wave swept him into the river below, where the currents dragged him under. They did not have time to celebrate. Even as the giant fell, the horizon was lighting with the approach of more forces, and Annabeth knew the second half of the night would be worse than the first. Still, as they raced back toward the plaza, she allowed herself a moment to hope, because if they could bring down the enemy's champion, maybe, just maybe, they could hold Olympus until dawn. The second half of the night began not with an enemy charge, but with a strange lull, the kind that made every fighter uneasy, because in war a pause rarely meant safety. It meant the enemy was gathering something worse. Annabeth stood on the makeshift barricade they had thrown up across the plaza entrance, scanning the streets through the faint mist that hung in the cold air, her knuckles white around the hilt of her sword. Percy was beside her, his breathing steady but his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight, and Thalia's bowstring was drawn though she had no target yet. Then came the sound, not the clamor of marching feet, but a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to thrum through the ground itself, rattling loose stones and sending ripples through nearby puddles. Out of the mist came shapes, first a handful, then dozens, not Dracini or Empusai this time, but armored figures in bronze so ancient it seemed green with age, their helmets adorned with plumes of black and crimson. They marched in eerie unison, weapons at the ready, and behind them came siege beasts, unlike anything Annabeth had seen, constructs of bone and metal, fused with magic so dark the air shimmered around them. These were not just soldiers, they were the enemy's final push, the hammer meant to break the last defense of Olympus before dawn. The barricade held for minutes that felt like hours, every inch fought for with blood and grit. But the sheer force behind the siege was too much. The barricade cracked under the weight of the constructs, bronze shields splintered, and the line began to bend. Annabeth threw herself into the breach, her voice cutting through the chaos as she shouted orders, redirecting squads, plugging holes in the defense wherever she could. The plan she had built in her mind weeks before was now being rewritten with every passing second, instinct taking over where strategy fell apart. A massive construct broke through, swinging a spiked tail that sent campers sprawling, and Annabeth didn't think she sprinted forward, ducked under its swing, and drove her blade into the seam where bone met metal. The construct howled like a living thing, reared back, and Percy's water slammed into it, toppling it into the rubble. But even victories cost time, and time was bleeding away fast. A sudden horn blast from the east made Annabeth's stomach drop. The enemy had flanked them, using the subway tunnels to emerge inside their perimeter. Now they were surrounded. For a moment she thought it was over, but then, like something out of an old myth, reinforcements arrived. The hunters of Artemis from the northern streets, Chiron leading a charge of centaurs, and even gods, minor ones, but gods nonetheless flashing into existence with weapons drawn. The plaza became a maelstrom of clashing forces, divine light against shadowed steel, the air thick with dust and the metallic tang of blood. Annabeth lost sight of Percy in the chaos, her focus narrowing to the fighters in front of her, to keeping them alive one strike, one block, one breath at a time. Somewhere in the madness, she found herself face to face with the enemy commander, not a giant, not a beast, but a demigod like her, though his eyes burned with the same unnatural power she had seen in the giant's weapon. His blade was faster than she expected, forcing her back step by step until her heel caught on broken stone, but she refused to give ground. Their duel felt like it lasted an eternity, the world narrowing to the ring of steel on steel, the flare of pain where his strike grazed her arm, the sharp inhale before she launched her counter. It ended when she fainted high, dropped low, and swept his legs out, driving her blade into the gap in his armor. He fell, and with his fall something in the enemy's momentum broke. The line began to shift in their favor, and as the first streaks of dawn touched the horizon, the enemy began to withdraw, melting into the shadows from which they had come. The war was over not with a triumphant cheer, but with a long, exhausted silence as fighters looked around, realizing they were still standing. Annabeth's legs felt like lead as she walked the length of the plaza, checking on the wounded, clasping hands with those who had fought beside her. She found Percy sitting on the steps of the Empire State Building, his head in his hands, and when he looked up at her, they didn't need words. They both knew what they had lost to win this day. The days that followed were a blur of rebuilding Olympus had survived, but barely, and the cost was written in every empty bunk at Camp Half-Blood, every quiet face at the dining pavilion. Annabeth spent weeks in council meetings, drafting new defenses, negotiating with gods who had suddenly remembered the value of their mortal children. There were celebrations, of course, feasts in the gods' halls, toasts to the heroes who had stood against the tide, but Annabeth never quite felt at ease in them. Her mind was always half on the next threat, the next shadow on the horizon, and yet, in the rare moments of stillness, she allowed herself to imagine a life beyond war. She and Percy took long walks along the shoreline, not speaking of battles, but of places they might visit, things they might build. She began sketching designs for a new wing at the camp library, a place of learning for future generations, because the greatest defense against the mistakes of the past was knowledge. The beyond was not a perfect peace. She knew such a thing was impossible in their world, but it was a space to breathe, to remember that they were more than the wars they fought. On a clear evening months later, Annabeth stood on the balcony of their cabin, watching the sun set over the Long Island Sound, and for the first time in years, she felt something close to contentment. The prophecy had come to pass, the war had ended, and those scars remained on the land. On their hearts there was still a future worth fighting for, and in that quiet moment, with the waves whispering against the shore and the sky painted in gold and violet, Annabeth allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had earned it. The war was over, the monsters gone, the streets of Olympus cleared of the last traces of battle. Yet for Annabeth Chase, endings never came all at once. They arrived in fragments, in the little moments between duties, the quiet of the Athena cabin at night, when the others had gone to sleep, the sound of the wind rattling through the pine trees above camp, the way the ocean light played in Percy's eyes when he smiled. She knew life would never go back to what it was before. Too much had changed. Too many friends had been lost. Too many truths revealed about the gods, the world, and herself. But in the slow days that followed, she also came to understand that survival was not just about holding a sword in battle. It was about finding ways to live, to laugh, to build, even when the shadows still lingered at the edges. Her mornings began with the hum of hammers in the distance as campers repaired cabins and walls. She would join them after breakfast, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back, sketching plans for stronger defenses, smarter layouts, and safer spaces for the younger campers. At night, she found herself by the campfire more often than not, sharing stories with the new arrivals, passing on what she had learned not just about monsters and strategies, but about friendship, loyalty, and the courage to question the world you've inherited. There were moments when the grief caught her off guard passing the climbing wall and remembering Selina's laugh, hearing someone mention Luke's name, seeing Grover's empty seat at the pavilion before his return from the wild. But grief, she realized, was not something to outrun. It was something you carried, like a scar, a reminder of the battles fought and the people who mattered enough to fight for. And there was joy, too, in unexpected places, in sparring matches that ended in laughter, in dinners shared with Percy by the shoreline, in the way the camp felt alive again with music and chatter. She visited Olympus one last time, before the gods fully sealed their gates for another age, walking its shining halls not as a soldier, but as an architect, noting the cracks and the possibilities. She met with Athena, their conversations sharper now, less like a child seeking approval and more like equals debating the future. And though her mother still spoke in riddles and challenges, Annabeth sensed a subtle change, a recognition, perhaps, of what her daughter had become. In the years ahead, she and Percy would face more quests, more dangers, because in a world where the gods still breathed, there was never such a thing as the last battle. But they would face them differently, not from a place of desperation, but from a foundation of trust, hard-earned through every trial they had survived. There were roads still untraveled, mysteries still unsolved, and Annabeth knew she would never stop seeking them. Yet, in this rare season of calm, she allowed herself to imagine more than just the next fight. She saw herself walking streets she had only read about, standing on scaffolds overlooking new cities she had designed, sitting at a desk covered in maps not of battlefields, but of bridges and towers, each one a promise of a world made better by the people who dared to dream it. On a warm summer night, long after the campfire had burned down to embers, she found herself on Half-Blood Hill, the pine tree swaying gently above her, the stars scattered thick across the sky. She lay back in the grass, the cool earth beneath her, and listened to the waves breaking softly in the distance, to the faint laughter drifting up from the cabins, to her own steady breath. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was no weight on her shoulders, no urgent call to action, only the vast open sky above and the endless horizon ahead. She thought of her friends, of those still here and those gone, and whispered a quiet promise to them all, that she would keep building, keep protecting, keep living in a way that honored every sacrifice made along the way. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of salt water and pine, and Annabeth closed her eyes. In the stillness, she felt the threads of her story, every quest, every loss, every victory weaving into something whole. She knew the world would ask more of her in time, but for now, here in this moment, she was home, safe, loved. And as sleep finally claimed her, the stars above seemed to burn a little brighter, as if the universe itself was keeping watch over the girl who had faced its storms and chosen, again and again, to build something better from the ruins.